students, this is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about consideration. If you're in my class, this corresponds to Unit 13. We'll talk about three things. Number one, what is consideration? Number two, some problems that I think students sometimes encounter when they're trying to figure this out. And number three, a few words about why we have this idea of consideration at all. So if you step back for a second and think about, well, when is it that a contract is going to be enforceable, you will undoubtedly recall Section 17 of the Restatement, which says that the formation of a contract requires a bargain in which there is a manifestation of mutual assent to an exchange and a consideration. We talked previously about mutual assent. That's offer and acceptance. Now we're going to talk about consideration, right? This other thing in the basic idea that you have to have certain things to have an enforceable contract. Section 71 of the Restatement tries to march through some of the key points that I think underlie what we think constitutes consideration and maybe what then distinguishes it from offer and acceptance. So number one, the first thing that says is that to constitute consideration, a performance or a return promise must be bargained for. Section 3 of the Restatement says that a bargain is an agreement to exchange promises or to exchange a promise for a performance or to exchange performances. One of the key things here is that consideration is, it involves some kind of exchange between parties. Part 2 of Section 71 says that a performance or return promise is bargained for if it is sought by the promisor in exchange for his or her promise and is given by the promisee, person to whom the promise is made, in exchange for that promise. Right? So mutuality seems to be what we're talking about here. Promising, one another, that sort of, we understand what that means. What are we talking about when we use the word performance? Subsection 3 of Section 71 of the Restatement says that a performance may consist of an act other than a promise, or a forbearance from doing something that you're legally entitled to, for example, drinking, which is what we see in the Hamer case, assuming you have the legal right to drink. Or third, the creation, modification, or destruction of a legal relation. So, seems like there's something about exchanges of benefits or detriments that are, contemplated and articulated specifically between the parties. Fine. Let's talk about some problems with consideration. First, how do we distinguish it from offer and acceptance? Isn't it all sort of the same stuff? Well, in a technical sense, no, it's not. Offer and acceptance are leading a court to conclude that a contract was formed. You could have offer and acceptance and still not have an enforceable contract if it lacks consideration. Right? So consideration is a sort of second step that courts take in deciding whether the contract really is enforceable. And so how do we then decide if there's something more than just offer and acceptance? Well, as I said, the Restatement is hinting at this idea of mutual inducement, which I guess in turn demonstrates the seriousness of the promises of the parties one to another, or the performances between the parties. I guess in a sense this shows that the parties really seriously considered the promises or performances they were undertaking. We have a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court Justice, that I think is articulating this idea. The root of the whole matter, he says, is the relation of reciprocal conventional inducement, each for the other, between consideration and promise. So something about, as I said, mutuality. What counts? Second question, what counts? How much consideration must there be? The answer is we don't really focus so much on the actual value, economic value, of what is exchanged. So in theory, the classic line goes, a mere peppercorn is sufficient. And of course, it doesn't really have to be anything material or tangible at all. Promises can be consideration themselves. Which then leads to the third problem that students sometimes have, which I think of as a problem of circularity. If a legally enforceable promise can itself be consideration, but all promises must themselves be supported by consideration to be enforceable, it seems like we have a circle, right? It sort of makes your head spin. As we'll see, I think that you can make some sense of this by focusing on some of the underlying policy goals, but it can be tricky. Number 4, must there be consideration for the modification of contracts? Say, fine, all right, we've got a contract, offer acceptance consideration. In the real world, it's very frequently the case that parties get down the road and decide they have to change something. Must there be a separate consideration for that change to be enforceable? Answer, generally speaking, yes. The pre-existing duty rule means that if only one party changes an obligation or right under a contract, but the other doesn't, then the pre-existing duty rule may render that contract unenforceable for lack of consideration. Number 5, what's the difference between consideration on the one hand and conditional gifts on the other? If I say to you, hey, go down the street, I'll buy you a Coke. Is there consideration? Answer, probably not. Why? Well, again, it has something to do with this idea of mutual inducement. We have a quote from Professor Williston, a famous old contracts guy, who says that, in trying to distinguish these two things, gifts from consideration, an aid, though not a conclusive test, in determining the answer is whether the happening of the condition will be of benefit to the promisor. So if I get something in exchange for making a promise to you, a court's much more likely to conclude that there is consideration. Third and final issue, why have any of this stuff at all? Why not just have offer and acceptance? Well, I think it has something to do with the overarching economic goals of contract and then subsidiary functions designed to protect courts. So first is often said to be cautioning. By saying that not all promises are going to be enforceable, if they don't have consideration, they won't be, we're in effect cautioning parties, warning them that if they don't really exchange some benefits or promises or experience some detriments, then the promises won't be enforceable as contracts. Number 2, I think, is an evidentiary goal. We want parties to exchange something in part not only to create economic value, but I think to increase the likelihood that there will be evidence of the promises left behind, which will then make it easier for a court to decide what the deal was if asked to resolve a dispute about it. And then third, channeling. This idea that we're channeling some disputes, some promises rather, to the enforceable category and others not. I think in part because what we're saying is that an overarching goal of contract law is to promote and encourage contracts that we think are more likely to create economic growth. To create economic growth, I think we tend to assume that there must be exchanges between the parties of some sort. Obviously, we'll see some cases where it's not always clear that anything is actually being exchanged, or cases where looks like there is something being exchanged and court saying, well, that's not enough. So this stuff can be a little tricky for students. Nevertheless, I hope some of these basic points provide a little bit of support. That's The Real Deal on consideration. We'll talk more about this in class. Till then.